Good evening, everyone, for the ones who just joined. All right, so we're going to start with the introduction. So O-levels and IGCSE both are very, very similar in business studies specifically. So I think they're one of those subjects that's almost 95% same. So if we look at these assessment objectives, I just want you to know that we're looking at paper one. So over here, when we look at knowledge and understanding, that's 50% of the paper. So that basically means that if you know the book by heart, cover to cover, the only marks you're going to get are 50%. So that's not even like grade C, that's not a good grade. So the remaining 50% is divided between application, analysis, and evaluation. Now, application is where most of the students, good students, also lose marks here. So this is the 20% of your score that you can really pick up even by doing this one session. So this is going to be my extreme focus: application, analysis, and evaluation, because of course this 50% you have to learn the content, you have notes or book, wherever you're learning from. That's good. And usually I recommend that the book is quite enough because there's not a lot of knowledge questions that come into your exam. Okay, so these are the assessment objectives that we just talked about: knowledge, application, analysis, and evaluation. And these are, of course, your command words. Now, the relevant command words here are identify. Now, a lot of the students, despite knowing that it only means that just mention the word. It could be one word, it could be a phrase, it could be a sentence. Do not write a whole paragraph in that, because that would just waste your time. And you really need time to think about how you can do application in your answers and how you can come up with better reasoning. So do not waste your time on writing a lot. And also don't try to, if they've asked for 2 reasons, don't try to give 3 or 4 or 5, because also that's not going to be counted, and that's again going to be wasting your time. Now, of course, paper 1 is every question is for 20 marks. So part A, 2 marks, B, 2 marks, C, 4, D, 6, and E, 6. So I'm expecting you all to know that by now. Now, when we look at the problems, okay, if we look at the problems here, now, examiner expectations are for part A and B, either it's definition, or it's a calculation question, or it's an identification question. Identify 2 features of a sole trader. Identify 2 reasons why you would want to increase market share. So this is what the expectation generally is in the question. And the examiner has commented that they are generally well answered. So less students are losing their marks in part A and B. However, where are the marks being lost? This is where the marks are being lost. Many candidates are unsure of the terms and lack clarity in their responses. So if you don't remember the exact definition, what you need to do is you need to give at least 2 points. For example, if you're talking about sole trader, or you're talking about, let's say, market share, and you don't remember the exact definition, so you could mention that market share means the business that has the maximum number of sales, or like that gives you an edge over your suppliers, something else. So if it is clarifying to the examiner that you know what you're talking about, you might get another mark for that. So even if you are not clear 100%, try to give at least 2 points related to that. Like, for example, sole trader, or an entrepreneur. Who's an entrepreneur? An entrepreneur is a person who starts his own business, and he's the owner of the business or takes the risk. So there have to be like 2 points mentioned there. And many candidates need to be more precise when defining business terms. So, of course, what I tell all the students that on the last day, or you have like 2 days left, go over all the definitions from the book, and your book is very nicely done that it is on the side. So just make sure you go over all the definitions. And if it is from the accounting section and you don't remember how to word it, you can just write the formula as well. You will still get marks. Now, sometimes, some of the students move the terms around. So they want to say, for example, sales revenue. So the money that you get from sales. Okay. Now, sometimes they might say the profit that you get from sales, that will be 0. So you have to be very, very careful in what terms you're using. And if you know a formula of something, please add that formula, because that will make sure you get those 2 marks. Because sometimes some students are nervous, so words थोड़े से आगे पीछे हो जाते हैं, so don't worry about that. Okay, इसके बाद हम अगर part C, let's have a look at part C, which is a 4-mark question. Now, in this question, the IGCSE students usually have the other format, which is the 4-factor. Now, this is the other format of part C, in which you are asked for 2 factors. Now, when you ask for 2 factors or advantages or disadvantages or whatever it is, 1 mark is straight away when you have identified it. Now, the new format is you're not required to give a heading. You just have to explain it. But as long as you mention it, you get that 1 mark. Now, the other mark, I've highlighted this in red, relevant reference. Now, that means if you're just explaining it, you're not getting the other mark. You have to give reference to the context. Now, context is the case study that you have. Okay, so that case study reference needs to be there. I'll explain that further when we move on. So 1 mark for identification and 1 mark for the relevant explanation. Now, usually, sometimes O-level students also get that question, and IGCSE students get most of these questions when you just have to identify 4 factors. Now, this is an easier question to score. You can easily get a 4 on 4 in that, because you're just getting tested on knowledge, right? So straight away, don't try to write paragraphs over there. Just write straight phrases, straight pointers, and that's about it. Just make sure do not write something that is similar or synonyms of each other. Okay. The problem with communication barrier is that the communication is unclear. The communication is distorted. It's the same thing. So you're not going to get marks for that. So make sure you give factors, advantages, disadvantages, ways, whatever is being asked, which are not overlapping. You can leave that also if you have forgotten. You come back to that later. Agar aapko bilkul yaad nahi aa raha, then don't leave it blank, but try to write something that is not overlapping. And make sure that it is absolutely different from each other. Because sometimes you're thinking in your head it's different, but the words that you use might be very similar. So that is something where you lose marks, which are really could be saved very, very easily. Okay. Now, a similar question is the part D, which is again 6 marks, and it is asking for, let's say, it's again for with 2 styles. When 2 factors are required, that means the 6 marks are broken down into 2 segments, 3 and 3. So in those 3 marks, 1 mark, of course, is for identification. So that's your knowledge. Then the other mark is for explaining what that means. And the 3rd mark is application. Now, what happens? You explain it really well and you come out of the exam room and you're like, oh, I've done really, really well. But what you forgot to do was application. This red part, so this danger red color I've put in there so that you remember that it had to be in context. Now, what does that mean? If you're talking about a restaurant business, you can't talk about products. You have to talk about meals. If you're talking about a bank, then you have to talk about services. You can't talk about products again. So whatever business is there, if it is a wholesaler, if it is a retailer, then you can't be talking about cost of production because a retailer is not producing it, right? Only a manufacturer will have cost of production. So choose your words, your vocabulary according to the business type, according to the business situation given in your case. That is what is going to give you this 3rd mark. Now, sometimes 3 factors are asked. Now, in this case, your 3 marks are easy to get because 3 marks are directly identifying. You get 3 on 3. Now, the other 3 are more difficult to get because they're like part C. If that explanation is not in context, it is a 0. Straight away a 0. So you could write a beautiful explanation, a very good explanation, amazing vocabulary, but no reference to the context, 0. So there is no, I'm also like the, Cambridge examiner for IGCSE business studies. So it's absolutely a 0. And when we look at the past papers, the sample answers, so they have given you more marks. Don't fall for that. They're not going to be that positively marking your paper. So you have to be very, very careful in these things. Now, this is what the examiner says, that for part C and D, what the problems are, what are the candidates required to do is, they're required to link each point made to the context. And, there is not enough stress I can put in that, because that is where the whole grade changes. It's 20%. So that means 20 marks, or at least like every question has 2-3 marks of application. And that's like 16 marks, almost 16 marks of application on 80. So if you lose those 16 marks, definitely you can say bye-bye to an A star. And if you've done really great on the other components, maybe an A. But if you do application, it's quite likely that if you know your content, you end up having an A star. Okay. So, and another problem that the candidates do is they use the same application. What they need to do is they need to use a different point of application. Now, what does that mean? In point 1, for example, the 2 factors are required. So in the first factor, they're asking you identify 2 advantages of break-even chart to ABC manufacturers, okay, manufacturers of furniture. So you've talked about the cost of production or the cost of wood that they're using, okay? And then you talk about the same thing in the second point. Then raw material, you know, you mentioned raw material wood, and then raw material wood in the second point. It's 1 mark, 1 application. So if you're talking about wood in 1, the other one you might be looking at the retailers, or you might be looking into, you know, the polish of the furniture, or, you know, the comfort of the furniture, or something else relevant to that, whatever you're writing about. But if you talk about the same point, same thing, same context, it's just 1 mark. You don't get the other one. Now, what are the areas of concern where students are losing marks in part C and D, not using information from the STEM? What is the STEM? The small case study, the 2-3 lines that are given at the top, in which if they talked about easier things to use are the number of employees. Okay, you can write down these things. One thing you can use is the number of employees, whether the business is small or large, whether the business is a sole trader, it's a partnership, private limited, public limited, whether the market is competitive, whether it's a multinational, right? These are the things that you can talk about in your answers. It's very easy to incorporate these things. Then what another problem that you do is you do not fully develop your answer. So you leave it halfway. You're like, okay, the point that you identified was maybe you're talking about. Okay, so sorry about that. Okay, so I don't know what that was. So anyways, so if you do not develop your point fully, you don't get the mark, because there's hardly 2 marks for development or 1 mark for development. So wo bhi agar puri nahi hui hai, so you lose that mark. So for that, you need to, you know, kind of explain. Now, what does that mean? Now, the students I've taught, they would know that I write so in a lot of their answers. Now, what does that mean? Okay, let's reduce the cost price. Why? Or we want to reduce the labor turnover. Now, labor turnover means that employees should not leave the job and they should stay back with your company. Now, it will reduce something. You want to motivate your employees. 2 reasons why it is a good idea, or 2 advantages of motivating your employees. Now, what advantage you mentioned? Less labor turnover. Now, when you're explaining, you're saying, if you motivate your employees, less people will leave the job. And that's good for the business. Good for ABC chocolates, let's say. That's not good explanation, because why is it good for the business? I don't get that. You should be saying it will help reduce recruitment cost, or it will help save training cost. And that is beneficial for the business, or that is beneficial for ABC chocolates, right? Now, if the case study mentions that you have to, the case study mentions that you are short on cash already, or you're a new business, then you can mention that as application. Since it is already a new business, reducing recruitment costs will really help their finances or their liquidity position. जितनी भी vocabulary आपकी अच्छी है, business terms आप use कर सकते हो, use them, but they have to be relevant. अब ये नहीं कि वो liquidity problem है ही नहीं उनको और आप mention उसमें कर दो, so it has to be relevant.